We all know that the best season of Invincible is Season 1. That will always be true. But damn, do they get closer and closer every year to beating, or at least matching, that insurmountable peak. And you heard me right when I said every year. That wasn't a slip up. Because many people have complained about the lacking animation, an issue I have no rebuttal against. Just look at some of these half-assed shots, but creates a trade-off I'm willing to suffer through so that when those annual warm winds come drifting in around April, like clockwork, so does Invincible. Would I be willing to wait longer for every season to get a more imaginative and innovative product? Obviously, but I'm also not a patient person, and I'm more than happy with what we're getting. That being said, my first topic, before I even get to what this video is actually about, is that animation. And I don't want to needlessly insult the animators. Lord knows that they're doing the best they can with the limited time they're given, but I can't help but look at some of these shots and wonder why the least dynamic and least creative option is always chosen. And I'm not just talking about the worst of the worst moments where the anime-esque rationality can be given to it, of having low quality, jerky, or even motionless images at times so that the animators can focus on the explosive scenes. No, I'm talking about everything. Because even when the budget is increased and the good animation team takes over, the camera is barely going to move, if ever. The lighting and shadow work will be minimal, if at all, and the character motion will be rudimentarily stilted, if not just static. Though there is the occasional moment of brilliance, I can't deny that, but I also can't deny that there's a part of me that does wish this show was at least half the quality of other seminal animated works. Even the recent video game has more imaginative camera work, and I always think back to this sweeping shot of Mark flying into the Flax invasion way back in Season 1. Because there is no reason why that level of quality and more can't be expected from a show backed by one of the largest and most profitable companies in the world. Just hire some more animators and let them cook. But needless to say, the floating PNGs are merely an element of this season not being as perfect as it could have been. Yet with near flawless moment-to-moment adaptations of the formative series it's based on, and thematically necessary additions every now and then, that with hindsight seem as necessary as they are obvious, I can confidently say that Season 4 of Invincible is the ideal mixture of breadth and depth. Expanding and fleshing out the ever-evolving universe that houses this galactic conflict, while still keeping everything personal and thematically concise. But bearing all that in mind, today I want to run through Season 4 episode by episode, moment by moment, comparing it to the comic in various places, and just looking at each individual aspect to identify their thematic relevance to this season's overarching concepts of pragmatic redemption, atonement, and as always with Invincible, utilitarianism, so we can find out if its favorable reception just came down to the hype, or if Kirkman was right when he said this year's installment of Invincible actually is their best yet. But enough preamble, let's just jump right in with Episode 1, Making the World a Better Place, where we pick back up with a deeply depressed Mark, who's been putting in work to save Earth, but has been banging his head against the wall doing so. And as Earth's strongest superhero, he doesn't just feel obligated to carry that out, he's convinced himself it would be immoral to not give everything to the people, forcing him to always be there, because a nanosecond of slacking off, or God forbid, a single mistake, equals untold death and destruction that Mark feels personally responsible for, superbly demonstrating why the soul-crushing responsibility that Superman upholds every minute of every day, under anyone else's control, would mentally shatter them in seconds. And for as much as Mark has his fun-loving moments, happily saving lives with a smile on his face and a catchy tune in the background, more often than not, he's going through it, flying around to a sad montage. And this season is no exception. But even as Mark goes home to shower and eat, He at least showers, because how the hell are you supposed to take care of everyone around you if you're not taking care of yourself? But he doesn't see the point in scarfing down some reheated food from hours ago just to need to be back out there in less than a minute. And when Mark sees an aged up from last season Oliver hanging up his tights for the day, kicking back to play some video games, it's like that triggers a latent fury within him. And honestly, I see Mark's point of view more than I do Oliver's. I'd hate to never relax and have to be locked in 100% of the time, but if lives can be saved, then superheroes better get their asses into gear. However, I love how the show presents that driving need as unhealthy and psychologically dangerous. But before Mark can look internally to get ahead of the temperamental collision course he's on, he chooses to simply attack the problem head on, white-knuckling it and pulling himself up by his own bootstraps. The same mistake too many of us make every day. And this is more of a discussion for much later on, but I wanted to bring it up now. How Mark ended the last season by saying he won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens his family's safety, choosing to say that directly after he'd collected another couple reasons to have wildly consequential PTSD and trauma. And at first, I thought Mark and Oliver were actually fulfilling that promise. I don't know, there was just something in the way Mark grabbed this guy's neck and Oliver punched this guy's head just enough to the side. But they're not just running through the motions, Eve most of all, though she does go for the smartest option when doing some bank robbers, demonstrating how she'd grown beyond rudimentary constructs, and in addition to that, she's running Invincible Inc., and is clearly the most mature out of everyone, excluding Debbie of course. But in this beginning montage, we also see Business Baby and Big Mildew, who I did have to look up to remember their names. Sorry to the fans of those guys, they're just not the most crucial of characters in my eyes. And as well as that, tons of new heroes who aren't important in the slightest, but we will be seeing again. And most crucially, as it just taps that happy chemical production in my brain every time I see it, is Oliver and Debbie's wholesome relationship, which is pretty much the same as Mark and Debbie's, but Oliver's younger and therefore receives more outward forms of kinship, which says a lot about Oliver because we know he loves it, but what that also does is demonstrate how Debbie is the best mom ever. And thankfully she gets a lot of character work this season, but before getting to that, let's keep this Invincible train moving and move on to one of my favorite characters in the entire extended Invincible roster, because it's while Mark is attempting to climb the insurmountable mountain of gaining the people's trust again, burning himself out in the process and only making him angry, that he meets Dinosaurus. And I know, not the most creative of names, leaning closer to the dumb side of naming conventions than I care to admit, but fortunately, he makes up for that and more in intriguing thematic conversations, which are morally complex discussions that I can't really get into, given the show has barely scratched the surface, but I do want to touch on Dinosaurus' notion of how there's too many mouths to feed, and how typically, at least for the big publishers, superheroes never actually make a difference in their worlds, rather maintaining the status quo before anything else, which has more to do with their writers and editors needing them to always be in the same basic environment to keep sales up, and less to do with those characters themselves or their themes, as much as some writers do try their best to defy that. But that creates a nice opportunity within Invincible, where the status quo can be constantly and legitimately challenged. Plus, I mentioned bad animation up top, choosing to play devil's advocate and really hammer home how disappointing the overall animation is, but to give them credit where it's due, right up front, the show gives us some genuinely well put together shots, with Mark flying away from the camera in a dynamic frame capturing the chaotic motion he's feeling, then displays the power Mark has grown into when he punches Dinosaurus a block away in the blink of an eye. But of course, before Mark can deliver the finishing blow, Dinosaurus transforms into an innocent man. And no future spoilers, I won't explain the mechanics of how, but as you could probably guess, the destructive and dangerous Dinosaurus is trapped within the body of an unassuming random dude, someone blameless and naive to everything going on, but just happened to find himself at the wrong end of a provoked Invincible, as Mark tiptoes into the danger zone. And I don't mean in a good way with Kenny Loggins, I mean the psychologically hazardous kind. Yet before he can even make that decision, he's interrupted by the newly reformed Guardians of the Globe, who got their old members back in a scene I glanced over, where Cecil demonstrates he's trying, but still dead name's Rex, and the Guardians are now led by Britt, who's seemingly just Cecil's new yes man, but he is a hero in his own right and proves himself soon enough. But here, Robot asks Mark if he's okay, showing just how much he cares. But I am distracted by how Zachary Quinto is no longer voicing Rex. I know that it doesn't matter, and we barely got to hear Quinto's voice to begin with, but I was just really looking forward to his voice reading some of the lines Robot has coming up seasons from now. That is, if he comes back from the Flaxen Dimension. Saved it. But back with Mark, we see him and Eve getting ready for the most awkward dinner of their lives, with Eve's dad, Adam, outdoing himself in douchebaggery, and Eve's mom, Betsy, outdoing herself in making me pity someone. Because goddamn do I feel bad for Betsy, just living in fear of her own husband, which is some dark stuff. But rather than dwelling on that really depressing notion, what I want to talk about here is the changes from the comics, because it's around here that the show diverts in a way I really appreciated. Though there's been plenty of recent changes in the narrative, such as Amber's new boyfriend not being abusive, and Invincible not meeting Wolfman, who we did get a glimpse of last season. Nevertheless, for the most part, the show has been a one-to-one adaptation with small ancillary changes for pacing or political correctness. Yet I love what they changed with Eve's dad making one good point of destruction following Mark. And he's still an asshole, going about it the wrong way, but he's just concerned for his daughter. And I hate him, but I can understand that. But after their heart-to-heart, Mark is sent further into his downward spiral, requiring the comfort and stability that Eve gives him, proving how good they are together and how they at least have each other, though trouble is just on the horizon. Because after a scene of Oliver getting a new suit that looks even more like his father's, causing Debbie to flash back to a reminder of Nolan's brutish ways being suppressed by her, filling her thoughts with anger and maybe some longing too, that's when the Sequids invade, which Cecil is barely able to contain with an electric dome, and sends in the Guardians of the Globe to save all the trapped people, but they are about to be swamped in Sequids. And of course, Mark and Eve can't help since they've been called to a power plant via Invincible Inc. to defend the world from a nuclear meltdown, one caused by Universa, who isn't important, but similar to Dinosaurus, and not just because of the dumb name, should be kept in the back of our mind. Besides, she's voiced by Storm herself, so obviously isn't going to be gone forever, clearly having some altruistic goal, but not taking the time to explain herself. But at the worst point ever, Eve's powers begin malfunctioning, yet she's able to finish the fight with the coldest right hook ever once Universa is separated from her staff. But Mark and Eve can't enjoy their victory, given they have to worry about the next world-ending event. And Eve can't go, forcing her to have to do the walk of shame home to her asshole dad, but Mark is teleported in to help. Meanwhile, just a brief detour, Paul and Debbie have a nice moment where he offers to move in together, and with a little hesitation, she agrees, showing how much Paul is putting in effort to join this family he stepped his foot into, and how initially welcoming Debbie is to that effort, though Paul does have his occasional awkward moment of not feeling entirely comfortable. Yet all that signifies to me is how authentic their relationship is, and how it's not excessively perfect, meaning Paul wasn't just a rebound, but was a sign of Debbie genuinely moving on. Anyway, back to the Sequids, because Rex takes a risky trip underground that he really should have found a better way to go about. I know he had to do it in secret, going against orders, but man, that was just a dumb call. Yet he manages to teleport everyone and himself out just in time, which brings us to the moment, where Mark flies to poor Russ Livingston, someone who's been trapped in his own body for years, and the last innocent person left inside the dome. And with that dome at 1%, Mark is faced with a choice that will define him, sacrificing Russ to save humanity from the Sequids, and ending their threat forever. Somewhat. And in the show, the editing makes it seem like there might have been time, just maybe. And that could be the point, more on that later on, but I kinda wish this followed what the comic did. Not just with a moment before where Mark has a slip of the tongue and screams out that the Sequids will never invade his planet, causing some hesitation, but having the Sequids overpower everyone there in a wave of nasty Starro knockoffs and holding them for a second, creating the opportune moment for Mark to explain how how he's been holding back for Russ's sake, and now that he's been given no choice, must make a hard call. Though the comic doesn't leave us in this moment for long, but the show does make the wise call to let that breathe for a while, because following an after credit scene of Conquest waking up, and as we all knew he would, immediately escaping, the narrative takes a break from Earth. But don't worry, we'll catch up with what's happening there after episode 2. I'll give you the grand tour. An unexpected yet greatly appreciated addition that truly demonstrates how, despite the rare minor changes I don't like, the show is leaps and bounds better than the comic. Because yeah, instead of just showing us a glimpse of what the Scourge virus did to the Viltrumites, let us see Nolan's past and how it built up to that catastrophic event. Let us live it and truly experience the horror. And this starts out with us seeing a young Nolan, voiced by the rich timbre of Talon Warburton, Kronk's son, where Nolan is clearly growing up to be the dick he always would be, yet undergoes the most noble task anyone can ask for: teaching, guiding the next generation into whatever is seen as greatness. And as Nolan shows his students a statue of Argal, Viltrum's greatest leader and the only person they have statues of, he gives them a pop quiz on why the purge following Argal's assassination was good in the long run, grabbing one of his students' heads and expressing how he's happy to pop it if the pop quiz isn't answered correctly. Yet it is, and the kid gets to live another day, though her and the rest of the students are also told that they'll have to come in prepared to kill one of their peers the next day. Then, to hammer the idea of indoctrination home even further, Nolan's parents rock up to celebrate his coming of age by jumping him. And just to highlight one small moment in this phenomenal fight scene, when a rock is kicked into the mom's eyes and she's thrown back, and the dad just bats her aside like she's nothing. That right there reminds me just how little Viltrumites care. However, for how cruel his dad is, Nolan's been learning compassion from him, because as the mom wants to beat her son to death for being weak, the dad shows restraint, and the mom is quite possibly there to be a setup for a departure from the comics way down the line. In fact, I expect a lot more about Nolan's true blood lineage, but even if not focused on anytime soon, Nolan having her as a mom explains everything. Of course he'd beat his son within an inch of his life. That's Viltrumite custom. But what I also think is interesting is how Nolan loses that fight to his parents, most likely causing Nolan to think of himself as weak, wondering if he's worthy of being a Viltrumite for the rest of his very long life, considering he's only alive because of mercy, which all just masterfully demonstrates how callous and cruel Viltrumite society is, how everyone has been brainwashed into it since birth, and how that tradition has been passed down and upheld by every generation, with the show in general just doing such a phenomenal job of filling out the culture and ideals of the Viltrumites, because we've been told for so long that they're evil, and they clearly are, yet we're finally given context as to why, because with enough coordination and cooperation, I guarantee you there were more than enough good Viltrumites to push back against the galactic tyranny of their empire, yet their goodness was either stamped out long ago or killed outright, because every citizen of Viltrum knows that if they aren't the strongest, aren't able to utilize their rage to kill, then they'll be killed, forcing everyone to get into the mindset of toughening up and making strength their only bedrock principle, something that also has a lot to do with the Viltrumites' take on romantic entanglements. Remember how Nolan's dad just batted his mom to the side? Yeah, they don't care about their partners. In fact, them even having partners is kind of insane to me, because they probably view coupling up only as a means to an end, where it's all about sex for breeding and nothing else. And if the baby isn't strong, it's killed and replaced with another. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but Nolan first experienced romance and love with Debbie, where he still thinks of her in relation to the lust he's been raised to prioritize, but misses her in the most honest sense of the word. Nevertheless, knowing the Scourge virus was around the corner, I was excited to see that story from the ground perspective, while giving depth to Nolan's character, not redeeming him, but continuing his path toward redemption. Yet once we finally get to that outbreak and see people start bleeding from every orifice imaginable, let me tell you, I don't think I was ready. And it's all set to the uneasy soundscape of Anna Van Housewolf's incredible 16-minute long song, Ugly and Vengeful, a track that's also used in Coraline Fargate's Substance, though this picks another distinct small portion of that song to perfectly place this scene in an indescribable sense of abject terror, featuring so much death, it's horrifying. And a two-eyed Krieg tells the disembodied voice of Thrag how hopeless it is for the Viltrumites, but Thrag, as always, maintains his logical stoic confidence, ordering a quarantine and execution of anyone who might be able to spread word of this tragedy. And to quickly talk about Lee Pace's exceptional voice acting, it's just perfect. Even in the presence of Krieg, or as we'll later see, Conquest, no one can hold a candle to Thrag's unquestioned dominance, and the fact that he's so calm makes it all the more terrifying when he isn't. Yet despite his idealism, we cut forward after even more death, noticeably not showing Nolan's mom dying, where Thrag is told by a now one-eyed Krieg that 99.99999% of their race was wiped out, and they won't be able to gain their numbers back without being inbred or deficient. Yet Thrag claims they are eternal and will stop at nothing to see that through, finishing this opening by revealing that it's been Nolan telling the story to Alan. And we see the pain on Nolan's face, with him understanding the suffering caused by his people, but still believing in what Viltrum stood for, how they brought their perspective of order to the galaxy, killing anyone who didn't comply with that image of their future, and doubling down on death every chance they got, but regardless, spreading their version of prosperity. Yet as Nolan mulls that over, Alan brings him to Telescria, the home base of the Coalition of Planets, as well as introducing Nolan to his girlfriend, Telia, who rightfully shoots him the moment she sees him. And Telia is another welcome departure from the comic, barely being a character on the written page at all, but having so much to do in the show, and voiced by She-Hulk's Tatiana Maslany no less. But naturally, on their way to meet Thetis, they conveniently mention the Coalition's mole twice. And the writers really want you to suspect Telia, but after doing a horrible job hiding Nolan's arrival to Telescria, they sit down to chat with Thetis, who doesn't want to do the Tulok pull for Nolan, but manages to convince him of the truth by revealing that he's the one who assassinated Argal, that he's the betrayer, which is an event we won't learn the details of for a little bit, but Thetis does give us some info for, though that does cause Nolan to be apprehensive about helping, telling Thetis that because of his friendship to Alan, he'll assist in gathering weapons against the Viltrumites, but won't fight in the imminent war. But to gather said weapons, they'll need to travel in secret, forcing them to take the worst ship in their fleet, the Venture. And I love this, but I just know that whenever my dad gets around to watching it, because he does enjoy Invincible, yet is a little slow when watching stuff, but whenever he does, I will know, and I'll be able to hear his disapproval from miles away, because the way that they absolutely drag the next generation's Captain Picard through the mud is gonna piss him off, though we all know it's in good fun. In any case, the first stop is finding Space Racer, who's magnificently brought to life with the voice of Winston Duke. And this is a guy who, as long as he has his gun, and aims correctly, is the most dangerous person in the galaxy. Plus, I guess he lives a super long time, because he hasn't had any food or water or any spare atmosphere to breathe in 100 years, and is only mildly hungry. But for me, someone who constantly needs some form of entertainment, that sounds like torture. Yet the minute Nolan apologizes, that's enough to get Space Racer to stop fighting, which seems a little quick, but maybe I just haven't been around the galaxy enough, because for the Gildarians, it's the same story, where the simple fact that a Viltrumite said, "I'm sorry," was enough. But they point him in the direction of Earth to Tech Jacket, and the Dornians point them in the direction of Carnage to Battle Beast. And some other threats to Viltrum are revealed to have been viciously wiped out, and all the while there's a pretty funny joke ripped straight from the comic about Nolan's inability to sleep. And while it still got a healthy chuckle out of me, this right here is the perfect case of why the show needed more time in the oven, because I want to see the anguish on Nolan's face as he's psychologically abused by Alan Alan and Telia's unending auditory torture, for every wrinkle to form tighter and tighter. And not just that, I want to see the moment Nolan realizes he's mad, not just because he can't sleep, but also because this is something he missed doing with Debbie. But instead, it's the same level of animation the comic has. A static image, not even a simple push-in. Though to be fair, they do add a great punchline of there being dozens of other rooms to stay in the entire time. But as you could guess, the last stop is the most dangerous. The Ragnars. Mindless creatures acting on instinct and nothing else, and therefore are inherently less threatening than a Viltrumite, but in raw strength alone are the most powerful beings in the universe. Defrosting and being barely conscious, yet are still able to easily overwhelm Nolan and Alan, who just barely survive. Though that does deepen their bond, because there's nothing better than almost dying for each other, something that Nolan and Alan have done a few times now, forging an unspoken promise between the two that will never be betrayed. Yet that's immediately tested when Nolan is talking to Thetis and just about kills him, as he learns that Thetis was the one who created the Scourge virus, using that drastic measure as well as killing Argal because he believed it would finally end the suffering the Viltrumite Empire inflicts. But it never did, and seemingly never will. But he's created a new, deadlier strain of the virus and is still prepared to use it. Then we get an after-credit scene of Conquest coming home and being given a task by Thrag, who's draped in a kilt and a fur collar, revealing Thrag in all his fashionable Freddie Mercury-esque glory. A phenomenal look that just screams how much Thrag loves his heritage, but that's something that will be left up in the air for now, because that brings us back to Earth with Episode 3, I Gotta Get Some Air. The episode that takes the definitive stance that Mark was right. Sorta. But before getting to any of that, we begin with Titan, because aside from Season 2, there's always gotta be a Titan-centric episode, showing us the ground-level crime stuff that Invincible doesn't usually focus on. And this installment of that features a lot of stuff straight up not seen in the comic, which will catch up with Titan and the Order every once in a while, but all of this is entirely new. And unlike something else I'll be talking about soon, this feels like it belongs. And sure, snippets of what comes after are taken from Invincible Returns, the one-shot everyone forgets about, but I'm talking about everything going on with Titan, because he meets with Machine Head, who's learned to smell the roses despite him lacking a nose, with him possibly even wanting world peace, but settling for his own privileged yet picture-perfect criminal empire. And Titan is given a warning that Liu is not just still alive, but is after him. And a change from seasons ago that still sucks is how Titan is no longer voiced by Mahershala Ali. Todd Williams, his replacement, does a great job, but he is just doing an impression. But before seeing more of Titan, Cecil expresses his disapproval of Mark's decision, how Invincible, in the heat of the moment, had inflicted mortal wounds on those who rightfully deserved it, but now he intentionally killed an innocent person, which was for the greater good, doing what was necessary. But even if you believe that to be true, that line of thinking going through Mark's brain is dangerous, because the kind of trauma that he's going through can break a person. He made the same decision Cecil would've, not making it the right thing to do, but the most logical, yet Cecil just doesn't want Mark to lose his cool.
Almost lost my cool there.
But speaking of losing their cool, D.A. Sinclair, thankfully not voiced by Ezra Miller, but Eric Bauza, is seen toiling away in the dark, troubled by the suffering he caused, and is tirelessly working to somehow undo that damage, kinda reminding you of someone. Then, the Guardians of the Globe come home to hit the showers, still arguing about the disastrous mission they went on, with some believing what Mark did was wrong, and others seeing it as a necessary evil. Regardless though, an innocent man died, which is never okay. But if Mark hadn't killed him, there was a high chance the Sequids would have taken over the world within minutes. But there was also a chance that the dome would have held and Bulletproof could have gotten there in time with the disruptor. Rex believes it would have held, world, and with him being as intelligent as he is, I'm inclined to trust his judgment. But like I said when I talked about it in episode 1, it's edited to be ambiguous. I wish it was a more definitive moment for clarity, but that's not what they were going for. Anyway, Rex is held firmly in his beliefs up until he pukes up a Sequid, almost becoming the next Russ Livingston and starting another Sequid invasion, beautifully highlighting what comic book villains do. They get defeated, then slink back into the darkness, lying dormant, building strength, and waiting to strike. Luckily, Monster Girl is there to stop it, but in that, Rex realizes that there is only a matter of time before one of their many villains becomes strong enough or lucky enough to permanently win. And to stop that, they must permanently stop them. Begging the question, was Mark right? Because aside from the unforeseen possibility of a Sequid being forward-thinking enough to crawl into someone's stomach rather than just taking them over, Mark killing Russ Livingston does end the threat of the Sequids. Because after Monster Girl squashes that last Sequid, they're never seen again. But overall, going back to Rex for a little bit, a lot of his character work this season is spent dealing with the ineffectiveness of being a superhero in a comic book world. Because, just as I talked about before with Dinosaurus, no progress can ever be made, and the status quo must always be maintained. The heroes defeat the villains, only to have that threat looming overhead for the rest of their lives, knowing they'll inevitably come back worse. And dealing with that in the best way possible happens to be the main theme of Invincible, answering the question of, how can superheroes actually make a difference? Then there's Eve dealing with her failing powers, lost in the confusion of why and the futility of who she is now, having built her life around being a superhero and not really being sure who she is without that. And Mark calls her, looking for a shoulder to lean on, and that's exactly who she needs to talk to, with them being emotional support for each other, but the call doesn't get through. And to really twist that emotional knife of drama even further, we then see Paul suggesting to Debbie that maybe it's time for a change, and that they live in a new home. And it's a nice thought, but with Paul hyper-focusing on how he doesn't want to have to fill the void that Nolan left, and Debbie not being sure if she's quite ready to let go of the past, it doesn't seem like a new house is in the cards. But getting back to the Titan of it all, he takes his family out on a stroll through the park, but needs a team of bodyguards keeping watch, who are quickly disposed of by Liu's hired assassin, Magnetak, a villain originally in the comic lineup hired by Machine Head way back in season 1, and the show needed a badass assassin, so they rightfully utilized him, making him look like a metal bender from the Legend of Korra. And I genuinely thought he'd get Titan's family, but Isotope proves his loyalty, and as we all know, rock beats scissors, with Titan declaring that Magnetak would never mess with his family again. And before we swing back around to that line, Donald swings around asking for a word with Mark. And in the comic, for this moment, Cecil just teleports in and costs the American taxpayers millions. But this is much better, with Donald doing the one thing Cecil never could: saying please. But that leads to Mark coming into the GDA and talking to Cecil about hard decisions, with Cecil expressing how Mark shouldn't have to make them, something that does make some sense, but would never last in the real world, because superheroes inherently have to make tough calls, and Cecil won't always be there to baby Mark. But right on cue, though it surprisingly wasn't planned, Sinclair waltzes in to apologize to Mark, knowing it'll never be enough, but highlighting how some people are capable of redeeming themselves through hard work and dedication to doing what's right given the opportunity, with Sinclair expressing how he'll spend the rest of his life making up for his mistakes, genuinely assisting the good guys and helping to save countless lives, being living proof that no one is too far gone to change and become a force for good, illustrating how Mark was right in the very isolated case of a mindless animalistic threat, but for anything else with a conscience and a sense of righteousness, it's not right to kill. And even further than that, it's not utilitarian. If your end goal is to save as many lives as possible, and there's someone who truly wants to help, then put them to work. Though even that's dangerous, because how can you tell if someone actually wants to help? Or what if they end up hurting someone again again, believing it's the right thing to do, which all delves into the delicious gray area, because saying every evil person should die is black and white, yet it's just as unrealistically absolute to say that everyone deserves a second chance and can be redeemed, which calls into question how you identify them. How do you tell the difference between someone who wants to help versus someone who might end up hurting others while doing good versus someone just gaming the system? Is there even a way to predetermine that? For me, I think the answer is no, with it being a problem that needs to be looked at on an individual case-by-case basis. But after dropping that thematic bomb on Mark's lap, Cecil chooses not to press his luck and doesn't tell him about Conquest. And honesty is best, but omitting the truth here was a good call, because Mark's got enough to deal with, though he goes home to finally talk to Eve and deal with some of those issues, getting a call from Invincible Inc. and rightfully agreeing that he's not in the right headspace to answer, so Oliver subs in. But as it happens, that turns out to be Titan calling in some help, given Titan has backed himself into a corner after choosing to not join the criminal order. Be that as it may, he doesn't want the second string's help, but agrees since it's better than nothing. And on the way to their destination, Oliver has a fun line about not wanting to kill only because it would make his mom mad. And somewhere around here, I might be mixing up some events, Robot is scanning Eve to see what's going on with her, and I'm very surprised he didn't immediately say, yeah, you look fine, but you do know you're pregnant, right? But he probably would have seen the baby and said that had it not been for the Flaxons interrupting. And the Flaxons are a perfect distillation of the themes Invincible presents, of how these villains only ever come back stronger unless they are stopped for good. And we haven't seen them in a bit, but that just means that they've had that much longer to plan, with them intending on taking on Omni-Man, but fortunately for them, only have to deal with Invincible and the Guardians of the Globe. And I am left wondering what they're truly after, if it's just slave labor or something deeper, but it is fun to see them, as always with their song Tom Tom by, excuse my French, holy fuck. And it sucks to see Mark handled so easily by a couple of power suits, but it does make sense. So, to stop the invasion, Rex and Monster Girl are forced to enter their portal and stop the transmitter that keeps them young on the Flaxon side. But before the Guardians can go to help, Cecil's yes man, Britt included, the portal is severed, stranding Rex and Monster Girl in the Flaxon dimension. And as everyone left ponders the eeriness of that situation, Mark jets off since Oliver needs some help and is in hot water. But together, Liu isn't a problem, though in their decently fun fight, there is lots of destruction. The city seems pretty desolate, and every superhero fight needs some property damage to keep it fun, but it always makes me wince in a show like this. Something that tries to uphold the fact that there's a cost to stuff like this, and not just monetarily. But as Liu runs, Titan goes to thank Invincible, and before he even has a chance to say anything, is beaten down by him, as Mark declares the same thing Titan had been saying earlier, that he wouldn't mess with his family again, with Mark wanting to kill him. But thankfully, this signifies a turning point for Mark, I'm glad to say, ending his mean streak. And though clearly too far and something Mark shouldn't have done, it's an act of cruelty that snaps him awake, finally getting Invincible to turn over a new leaf, though he's still not okay. And after a scene of Titan giving in and joining the Order, Mark wakes up from a nightmare, unable to think from the mental torture he's been going through, but is, yet again, unable to talk to Eve about it, since she's stuck in the bathroom, finally understanding why her powers aren't working, bringing us to Episode 4, Hurm. Wait, let me try it. Sounds more like Yoda. Is that staying in the video? We'll see. But all in all, with episode 4, I have no problem with when the show adds stuff not in the comic. As discussed, tons of the last episode was new, and I loved it. But this is obvious filler, which doesn't automatically mean it's bad, and there is some genuinely good stuff here, don't get me wrong. But my biggest problem is that, unlike last episode, you can tell it wasn't a part of the comic. It's not bad by any means, but it's not nearly as good as the rest of what we got in this season. season, making it relatively subpar in context to everything else. And I'll get into specific problems, breezing pretty quickly through this episode, but I do like how we begin with Mark talking to Art. He doesn't talk about how he sees the black suit as cursed like he does in the comic, but it does adapt how Invincible gets his mojo back, with Mark expressing how he wants to be better, but just doesn't know how, because the world is pretty stubborn, and Mark wasn't quite ready for that. But luckily, he also gets to chat with Damien Darkblood about how Mark isn't becoming his father, how he's inquisitive, asking questions first, then, if necessary, getting to the punching. And what's more, that's what Mark has always done, noticeably being in contact with a coalition of planets because of his ability to communicate, entirely unlike what a Viltrumite is raised to do. Yet this ends with a decisive moment of Mark realizing that killing as a final resort isn't the worst thing in the world, rather than when he just lies to himself in the comic and says he's done killing, showing how Mark is, or at least becoming, more mature. Plus, they make fun of the incessant nanotech helmets that need to die. But that's about all the positives I have to say, because this was just a low point in the season for me, mainly down to 3 reasons. 1, because they have this awesome lore and backstory of this hell having multiple ages and wars battled across centuries, but rather than a Lord of the Rings way of making the world feel expansive and bigger than we know, that history is just spouted at us by Damien, making it all feel small. And then there's reason number 2, Satan himself. Because I love that Bruce Campbell gets to ham it up, and the quickness of Mark going to kill Satan upon meeting him got a healthy chuckle from me, but just about everything else with him was severely disappointing. He has a cool, freaky transformation that ends with a weird and oddly simple design, then proceeds to do nothing in the final battle. Even after being set up the entire episode as this eternal and powerful figure, he does nothing. Then, number 3, the ultimate villain, I don't even remember their names, trying to get out to destroy the world and needing to be tortured to be kept at bay is an interesting concept, but all we see of that is one popping up and Mark fighting it, essentially just taking a rolled up newspaper and going, "Hey, knock it off, you get back down there." Which, I don't know, it was just weird. Though I guess that does kind of explain why there are kaijus on Earth. But during this, Eve talks to a recast William about the pregnancy and about how she's not ready. And I mean, no one ever is. But especially without Mark's support and her believing she isn't, she's not ready. Though William does say what everyone's thinking, that she needs to talk to Mark about this. But thankfully, this all leads to a scene of Mark getting his mojo back with the classic look, with him accepting that there are necessary evils in doing good, but doing good is still the right thing to do, choosing to tackle his problems with a smile and not with his fists. And then he comes home to find that Debbie and Paul are moving into a new place, and if he plans on living with them, he'll have to move as well. But Mark doesn't let that shake him. He's truly turned over a new leaf, accepting that change isn't bad and moving on. And he and Eve finally get to talk on their roof, which has pretty much become their spot, and Mark explains how, as much as he'd like it to be, his mojo isn't quite back, and he isn't okay, yet he's pretty sure he's on the right track. And as Eve is about to mention the big thing on her mind, which would likely shatter Mark's world, Alan and Nolan beat her to it. Then there's an end credit scene teasing that there's a bigger mystery with hell coming to Earth, and maybe I'll care about this in the future, but right now, I just don't. And I'll likely forget about this storyline, considering there are much bigger fish to fry, such as what we see in Episode 5, Give Us a Moment. And in the week of speculation beforehand, I figured this week's episode would be set on the spaceship, filling out the character dynamics, blazing past the Earth stuff, and essentially being a bottle episode. But nah, we spend a lot of time on Earth, then spend ample time on the spaceship, then get the perfect action climax, which was great escalation and just cinema. But let's get into it, because Mark agrees to fighting in this galactic war, chuckling at the notion that he could possibly trust his father, but knows that if he doesn't go now, the threat could come to him. And after that, we get what is quite possibly the best scene of Invincible ever, because Nolan decides he needs to apologize to Debbie, and my god, Sandra Oh, I was not familiar with your game. But even before she says a word, the way she opens the door and all you see is her silhouette, god damn, that's a power move. Makes Omni-Man, a Viltrumite, look like a scared deer in headlights. And their dialogue shows how much these comic book writers have matured, because Debbie does deserve an apology, but she also could have lived the rest of her life without Nolan. Additionally, instead of doing the right thing and prioritizing Debbie, Nolan makes it about himself, expecting a forgiveness or something in return for his apology, and thus inherently goes about it all wrong. Though I do think it's interesting how Nolan confesses that his battle with Mark was about trying to convince himself that he's still a loyal Viltrumite, something I already assumed, but now with the added layer of Nolan knowing that he's not, and he's terrified of what that means. How, after a century of living, 20 years on Earth with Debbie made him human, and coming to terms with that, he'll spend every waking moment repairing the damage, which Debbie laughs at, speaking her first words to Nolan since season 1, as she points out the ridiculousness in thinking any of that can be mended, because the damage has already been done, and it might be too little, too late. Nolan's genuinely sorry, and he's trying to prove that, but he's still making stupid mistakes and lapses in morality, saying he never loved Andressa, Oliver's mom. Of course, she was a rebound from Debbie, but he loved her. However, he misses his wife. But Debbie tells him to get the fuck out. And as he flies away, there's almost a hint of resentment, maybe some anger on Nolan's face, making me wonder if he thought about something violent, then ran at the prospect of that. But perhaps I'm reading too much into it. Nonetheless, that sadly triggers Debbie to get a drink, as she starts to regress, thinking of it in terms of Nolan and playing right into his manipulation. And Nolan may not have meant to be doing that, but unintentional manipulation is manipulation nonetheless. Fortunately, Mark is there to remind her of how he's going out not because his dad told him to, but because it's the right thing to do. And just as the mood starts to turn around, Oliver comes home and finds out what all the fuss was about, though it's revealed in the next episode that he already knew his dad was back, making him even more pissed simply because Nolan didn't bother to see him. And in the face of all this, Oliver declares that he's going to war too. And I get it, Oliver, you want to avenge those who killed your biological mom, and he can help. I mean, he is getting exponentially older every day, meaning he's probably just as mature as Mark, if not more, and he's not a kid anymore. But dude, you're not ready. Yet just to have her two boys watching over each other, Debbie agrees so long as they have a sweet family dinner. And the comic has Mark and Eve going on a date, recapping everything that had happened until then, which was still nice, but this is 1,000,000 times better, with the only added thing that I would have liked to have seen would be in one of the jump cuts, seeing a depressed Nolan spying on them from rooftops away, wishing he could be a part of the family he ripped apart. But instead, he visits Art, expecting a friendly chat, which he sort of gets, but also ends up facing a cruel reminder of the reality in his situation, where Art does something that made me rewind and watch the entire scene again, that being when he doubles over in panic the minute Nolan leaves, forcing me to inspect every minuscule detail in Art's animation, and behind that, Mark Hamill's voice acting, because we all assumed he's scared, especially from the way that Nolan appears like Freddy Krueger, but knowing that Art is shitting his pants the entire time, 1 second away from a panic attack, but still manages to put on this air of friendship, says so much about him and his bravery. I guess with him and Debbie, at least in the backstabbing face of Nolan, there's just a lot of that going around. But before heading out, Mark and Eve have one final chat about their losses, of change, and the indomitable love between them, where Eve should say something about the baby, but doesn't. And I understand she doesn't want another thing to weigh on Mark, with him possibly not wanting to even go upon hearing that, but hearing the news could be an inspiration to him. Yet even without that, Mark promises he'll live, and that he'll come back home, leading to what is most likely many sleepless nights for Eve. And here they could have easily just ended the episode. It would have felt short and uneventful for action fans, but it is dense in character drama, yet we're just getting started, because in the next morning we see the final good goodbyes being said, and Oliver leaving with all of his packed homework, which we all know his ass isn't doing, but he hugs Paul, who Mark also gives a respectful handshake to, and Mark gets to become his dad for a moment, and that's the neat thing. It's in a good way. But upon entering the venture, Nolan is pissed to see Oliver, though he quickly accepts that because he chose not to be involved, he doesn't get to have a say in this decision, with Mark saying how it was a family decision, and calling out how Nolan is no longer a part of that family, which is so much better than the comic, where Nolan just lets him tag along, and Oliver instantly loves him. But that also brings us to Zoe Dutch's tech jacket rocking up, and I kinda skipped over her introduction, so let's move back a bit, because it was fun seeing her fight the Order member with a punny name, Walking Dread, with a suit voiced by LeVar Burton himself. But overall with her, I'm just glad there isn't tons of idiotic and immature pushback against Tech Jacket's gender change, though I admit I didn't look that hard, and I guarantee you it's out there, but I'm fine with Zoe. Not every character has to be a white man, especially considering that, in the comic, Tech Jacket looks exactly like Mark, and we've already got one of those adapted into the show. But to wrap up her introduction, she stops Walking Dread with the most powerful cliche of all, too much power, and after that, Alan goes to her home base satellite and recruits her, where her dad is more than happy to support her, even packing sandwiches for the road, and I kinda wish more was dived into about how immature he is, with his comic past having dealt with mobs and all kinds of sketchy stuff, but wanting to be the guy in the chair for his daughter. I mean, Eve's dad is horrible, but at least he has a more realistic sense of the danger superheroes face, particularly when in a war against extremely powerful Viltrumites. But again, Zoe's dad just packs some sandwiches, which you know as a sandwich reviewer, I love, though Zoe won't be eating her dad's sandwiches for long since it's a 2-week journey, and the comic has them instantly attacked, but as I'd hoped, we spend a lot more time in this trip, with everyone bonding over the course of that time, sharing stories and having meals. Yet Nolan is lost in thought and alone. And there's also a throwaway line where Telia reminds everyone to get their communication implant, and it's a convenient way to have everyone be able to talk in space, but it's important to keep in mind that everyone's got one. But here we also see Oliver and Zoe having some chats, making me think they could become more than friends, though as we'll later find out, she's not quite his type. And we also see Oliver and Alan bonding, Oliver steering clear of Nolan, and Nolan getting sad at the thought of the perfect life he threw away. But before they reach Telescria, Zoe's suit sensor trips, giving them only a moment's warning as they jettison the bridge of the ship to escape destruction, leaving everyone no option but to fight, because they're ambushed by the Viltrumites. And there's only 3 of them, one being a random new dude, the other Steve Harvey, and the last being Conquest. And here, I haven't looked at how there's still 20 minutes left in the episode, and I'm confident it's going to cut to credits. But yet again, the writers had better things in mind for the pacing, launching into one of the best fights in the season, second only to what comes in the penultimate episode. But Oliver makes it easy for Conquest, going right to him, yet he does manage to bust out some moves, holding his own for about 5 seconds. And as well as him, Zoe can't do much against the Viltrumites, making me wonder why she was brought along, but soon enough, mainly in that penultimate episode, she does develop some damaging weapons. But before the brawl I know you want to hear about, Conquest and Nolan have a chat, where Conquest gets to prove how his passion is not for conquering, but instead in shit-talking. Oliver almost gets that knife hand thingy the Viltrumites do, and Alan, as always, is Alan. But during all this, Oliver gets punched in the gut by Lucan and needs to breathe, darting to the nearest planet, and Conquest sees, kneeing Mark in the face to get him back for making fun of how he bared his soul and to boost off of him, leading to one of the rawest frames in Invincible. Yet again, if the penultimate episode didn't exist, it would take the cake, but I think we all know what beats it. But now, just looking at this, let me tell ya, it's like a religious experience to behold. I mean, there's not much animation to it, backing the idea that there could be more creativity in the momentum, but it's not like there isn't any anxiety felt, with Conquest appearing out of the blue like a scary hallucination, one that's, unfortunately for Oliver, very real, and is about to pimp slap him even worse than last season, but is tackled away by a yellow blur at the last second, finally giving us Conquest vs. Invincible Round 2, which is basically shot for shot what's seen in the comic, because of course they weren't going to mess with Peak, but as always with the show, it has necessary added moments to let it breathe, and to add character. Although the comic clarifies that this right here knocked the wind out of Conquest, and that's why Mark was able to choke him out so quickly. Because if you remember, Viltrumites can hold their breath for a long time. But as Mark clenches his grip tighter and tighter around Conquest's throat, there's a great sense of chaos as they zip around, crashing through mountains and wrecking everything in their path. At times, being unclear who's flying who, though most of the time, Mark does just seem to be holding on for dear life. And you always know the good animation team takes over when there's more detail and fluid motion. But most of all, the clearest sign is Mark's hair. If those luscious locks are flowing in the wind, you know it's time to lock in. Nonetheless, I still could have used more animation to sell the brutality. Not in the organ pulling, we're not quite there yet. I just mean when Conquest is punching Mark in the gut to try to shake him off. There's some great sound design to those hits, but I want to see Conquest's fists being driven deep into Mark.
What?
Not just hearing the crack of bone, but seeing ribs breaking. But of course, upon seeing that this unassuming twerp is actually going to kill him, Conquest sees no other alternative but to do the knife hand, which he probably should have done earlier, but Conquest was never known for his intelligence. Yet even after getting a hand through him, Mark doesn't stop. Yet again, proving how he may not be the strongest physically, but when it comes to mental fortitude, Mark is unbeatable. Meaning that in any war of attrition, Mark's unending power of will always win. That is, unless it's against Thrag. But before commenting on that jaw-dropping moment of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, there's even more brutality and gore to discuss. And as Mark doesn't stop for anything, Conquest sees fit to grab some organs and start pulling. And this whole sequence could have been half the length and it still would have been too long, forcing the viewer into this intentional discomfort that may even go as far as to make you queasy, especially when we hear Mark dry heaving and barely able to vocalize the word help. But all in all, for as much as I can complain about there being too much gross gore, it's not gore for gore's sake. Not only is that just the kind of show that Invincible is, but it features continuously escalating danger, establishing character threats and narrative stakes that only get bigger and better. But naturally, as he's inclined to do despite his guts being taken out, Mark survives, leaving us in the world-shaking aftermath, Alan and Zoe stuck to a Viltrumite ship like a barnacle, or more accurately as they themselves reference, like the Millennium Falcon, and everything building to war, which technically started the minute the Venture was attacked, but well and truly begins in Episode 6, You Look Horrible. Kicking off with Thetis announcing said war, giving us a fun back and forth parallel speech between him and Thrag, with each thinking themselves superior. Thetis using the Viltrumites' own egos against them, and having developed specific weapons thanks to Nolan and Alan, and Thrag with only about 50 followers left, and barely loyal armies to pick up the slack, fighting for them solely from fear, still seeing the Viltrum Empire as unstoppable. We even get a kind of battle board that is the same for each side, as if someone's out there impartially making a helpful hologram UI for everyone. And I still would have liked to spend more time in the trenches of that war just to show how expansive this conflict is, yet I do like the extent of it that's seen, considering the bulk of this episode and the bulk of what I want to discuss is on Nolan and Oliver. I mean, Thrag's arguing with Argall's skull, Zoe and Alan are off gaming, and Mark's slowly recuperating, looking better and better every time we see him, after some delicious alien eggs, that is. Not that kind. And I'll kind of cover all of that, but man, it is just amazing to see Nolan and Oliver's dynamic explored. And I remember the time they spend on this planet being much longer in the comic, but the show condenses that to 2 months, which at first feels like a missed opportunity to put the boot in with Mark spending even more time away and giving Nolan more time to bond with his boys, but this was still nice, delivering on everything that was needed and more, because the minute the adrenaline adrenaline and shock from seeing Mark so messed up wears off, Nolan and Oliver are kinda just left to hang around. The option is always there to just fly planet to planet to the Coalition, or back to Earth, but they can't just leave Mark. So they're forced to do the one thing Nolan didn't want: to bond. Getting off to a rocky start when Nolan honors Conquest with a grave, which is something that is a whole other discussion in and of itself. That is to say, given a chance, Conquest may have been redeemable, but he still willingly and happily killed a lot of people. So does Hitler deserve a nice plot of land? Oliver sure doesn't think so, and the fact that Conquest did sets him off. But Nolan, trying to be the provider for his boys, kills a surprisingly tough alien bug so that they can cook it for dinner and squeeze some stomach juice into Mark's mouth. Yet Oliver is justifiably resistant to Nolan's advances. But seeing an opportunity to close that gap, Nolan wakes him up bright and early for some training, provoking Oliver to finally letting those feelings out rather than keeping them bottled up. Though saying that might be giving Nolan too much credit, because the way he angrily reacts to Oliver's shove proves he didn't plan any of it, and instead of provoking Oliver with a clever end goal in mind, he was simply doing it absent-mindedly. Nevertheless, that does get Oliver to actually talk to his father, immediately bringing his fury bubbling to the surface and exploding out, revealing that he wasn't just pissed at Nolan for not seeing him, but also for throwing away everything about him in hopes that Debbie would hug him, because as it turns out, he was there, listening in on Debbie and Nolan's whole Emmy caliber conversation. Like Mark, Oliver wanted to be just like the hero Omni-Man, or at least the hero he was. Oliver may have even idolized him more, only ever seeing his dad when he was a baby, and despite plenty of people bringing him up to speed with how terrible Omni-Man had become, created this perfect image of him. But now that Oliver finally gets to meet his hero, someone who's actually trying to do better, he's let down, telling him it's too late. And as Nolan sits with that, Zoe and Alan eventually finish their game and escape from the Viltrumites by getting back to the Coalition, which happens thanks to Space Racer and his magical gun, which I would say incinerates anything hit by its laser, but it's not even that. It leaves a devastating white-hot glow, cauterizing everything hit by it, and it's much more likely that the gun just destroys stuff, but it's almost like it teleports whatever's inside the laser. You know, matter not being able to just be destroyed and all that. Though whatever it is, considering each shot goes on forever, statistically, some of these had to hit something way back there, making me think of how many people light years away Space Racer has inadvertently killed. But he's on our side taking out Viltrumites, so it's okay. And as Zoe and Alan get back to the fight without the shower and sleep they were hoping for, we cut back to Nolan finally convincing Oliver to eat, tempting him with the best cut of the raw meat, which I guess tastes good, so maybe it's like sushi, trying to bring up Andressa, but him and Oliver are not there yet. And Nolan's going to have to make peace with the fact that talking about her, sharing those memories, isn't up to him, it's up to Oliver. Luckily, to help move that process along, they gotta get some more nutritious food for Mark. And Nolan sees those aliens as too dangerous, telling Oliver to stay back and keep watch, and trust me, I get it, but Oliver proves himself in physical power, the quickest way to Nolan's heart. Yet it's upon their victory that Nolan finally takes his first real step towards redemption and begins empathizing with others. Because as Oliver stops him from killing the alien, the idea is presented to Nolan that this creature might just be intelligent, and therefore deserves mercy and respect, causing one thought to pin against more and more and more until a rock slide of wisdom cascades into Nolan's subconscious. And it's notable that Oliver is the one to crack open his cold heart and cause him to more carefully consider his actions, given everything that Oliver is preaching is coming straight from Debbie, the person most capable of teaching morality and goodness. Meaning Nolan already knew all of this, but just needed a reminder from Oliver, especially with that reminder appeasing to the lowest level of his morality and humoring the selfish side that's usually ignored in favor of unrealistic expectations of immediate virtuousness. Rather, arguing that by not killing the alien, they're leaving the opportunity open for a continuous supply of eggs. And elsewhere, Zoe and Alan get back to Telescria, where the, I don't want to body shame, but of the two receptionists, it's not the skinny one, is surprised that they're alive, which should be eye-opening for anyone with half a brain cell, but for those unaware, there's still a moment given to accusatorily point at Telia for a second. But to relieve some of that manufactured tension, Battle Beast is reintroduced and is promised the bloodbath he's been waiting for, one in the form of war. But no one wants to hear me talking about something boring like an expansive intergalactic war being fought on multiple fronts. Besides, we're not quite there yet. First, we get a scene of Nolan attempting to make some small talk about food, only to have Oliver drop a bomb on him, not just asking a question about his biological mom, but asking the question, why Nolan had him in the first place if he didn't care about his mom, which shocks Nolan at first, as he's hesitant to walk into yet another conversational landmine, but Nolan takes it as a sign to speak honestly and openly, telling Oliver how his time on Thraxa may have been a mistake, but having him wasn't. He falls into the same pitfalls he's been foolishly ignoring, continuously looking for ways to find the easy way out, and reminding me of a toddler making their first mistake, attempting to minimize the damage before anything else, rather than just owning up to it. But Nolan is slowly learning that the difficulty of taking accountability for your actions is worth it, and that it's not about changing the past, but wholeheartedly acknowledging it so that you can move forward with newfound wisdom, leading us to the fun upbeat montage I was getting at earlier, which has a healthy amount of bloody, brutal war. But as per usual with this episode, I want to focus on what's seen on the rock planet, because Oliver gets a hit in during him and Nolan's latest sparring session, something you know Nolan respects, and they get to have the ultimate father-son trip. Fishing. And after bonding, they check up on Mark, who'll wake up any day now. Yet Oliver has mixed feelings on that, given he's grown to kinda like it here, becoming comfortable enough with Nolan to the extent that he confides in him something extremely personal, how he found a lobster attractive, though he did still eat it, which almost results in them having the birds and the bees talk, which I feel like Oliver probably already knows. But luckily, Nolan doesn't have to explain the intricacies of love and romance to him, and they go back to their home base to find that Mark isn't there, having woken up, presumably freaked out, knowing that someone was sheltering him and taking care of his injuries, but having no way of learning that it was his dad and brother. So he goes to the nearest landmark, a grave. And I didn't even think of this, but Mark immediately starts to consider that the grave is for his dad, or worse, because he doesn't even remember killing Conquest. But luckily for him, Nolan and Oliver fly over to show they're not dead. And Mark's got a scraggly beard, but the facial hair I really want to focus on is the peach fuzz on Oliver's chin. And part of me wishes there was excessive, disgusting detail on Oliver's chin when we see it, like one of those SpongeBob or Ren and Stimpy push-ins, marking yet another moment where I wish the animation was at least a little better, but it still got a giggle out of me, so the moment succeeded. But with the Grayson clan at long last ready to leave Zack Snyder's Krypton, the show decidedly cuts to Thetis eloquently addressing the Coalition of Planets, whose speech prematurely praising the Coalition for winning the war is interrupted by a devastating attack, with Thrag sneaking a warship and a half-dozen Viltrumites to Telescria thanks to a downed security shield, and ordering that no one be left alive, striking at the hearts of most everyone's ignorant notion that war will never come home to them, which is perfectly demonstrated in Telia's understandable panic attack. Seriously, I stub my toe and my brain goes into life or death mode, so I can't imagine how horrific it is to experience something like this. But Telia shakes it off and calls in their air support, though not a lot can be done about the Viltrumites' attack. Alan's punching people into space, and Thetis is getting his licks in, proving he's not too old to hand Krieg his ass. But aside from them, there's not much anyone else can do. Zoe is trying, but just ends up getting ragdolled by Anissa and about to be killed, but is miraculously saved by Mark, swooping in to come to the rescue, flying in with Nolan and Oliver to turn the tide, and telling the Viltrumites to get on out of here.
Get on out of here!
Though they don't actually leave until Thrag himself orders it, which he does only because he almost loses the one thing he loves, aside from Viltrum itself. But on the ground, Nolan validates all the effort and growth he's been undergoing when he tells Oliver not to hurt the grunt soldiers fighting on behalf of the Viltrumites, understanding that they're not loyal to the Empire, are only here out of fear, and will happily turn against them when given the chance, which all still tips towards the utilitarian, self-serving side of of ethics, so maybe Nolan's not quite thinking about someone other than himself, but does show that he's at least practicing what he's preaching, and not just that, taking it to heart. But soon enough, Oliver realizes what the real threat is and goes to take it out, flying through Thrag's ship in a pulled back wide shot that rudimentarily shows the damage with some explosions, but is epic nonetheless. And I doubt Mark and everyone else would have followed even if given the option, but they're forced to stay and lift the crumbling ship into the atmosphere and out of danger. There's still plenty of metal debris falling down and presumably causing untold death and destruction, yet this whole sequence is a nice touch, especially in a genre that usually just blows up a ship and never acknowledges the millions of lives underneath that are gone because of it. But even without the two halves of the ship crashing into civilization, the city is still totaled. And as Alan looks at the devastation, reeling at the thought of this not being the end of this bloody war, Thetis attempts to console him by saying that it's a minor setback, which is probably true in his perspective, someone who's seen this level of death and more, but for everyone else, it's rightfully crippling. Yet they can't even mourn the thousands, maybe even millions lost, since they have to deal with the mole. And it's great to finally have that storyline wrapped up, given it had been up in the air for seasons now, but the mole's shot in the head by his brother, or whatever he is to him. Fortunately though, that doesn't kill him, and they still get to question the mole for information, telling everyone that Thrag was attempting to wipe out Thetis and his allies, in hopes that without their leaders, the coalition would dissolve. But since that failed, Thetis decides to return the favor in episode 7, Don't Do Anything Rash. Albeit that does skip over what is Invincible's best and dumbest after credits scene, and obviously I loved it. Keep having silly jokes like that, and Invincible will be my favorite show of all time. But for real now, off to episode 7, which opens up on something we shockingly didn't get to see that much of, if at all, in the comic. That being an extended look at Viltrumite's past. And I'm not sure exactly when it's supposed to take place, but we do know it's a long time ago, where Thetis is still a loyal follower of Argal's empire. And here, I want to take the time to look at Thetis and Thrags' characters. Two diametrically opposed people whose beliefs differ only on one issue, with Thrags seeing Viltrumites as the only people that matter, and Thetis seeing the truth that all life matters. And this episode's opening masterfully tells us everything we need to know about that, covering an attempted coup by the Empire's Rellonian slaves, where Thetis argues to show them mercy as they've demonstrated the very strength the Viltrumites praise. And if compelled to be on their side, the Rellonian strength could be beneficial to the Empire. Yet Thrag, bred and groomed to be Argal's perfect specimen, isn't having any of it. He's loyal to his Emperor, hanging on to his every word, but he sees everyone else as beneath him, especially other species. Though when given the opportunity, in fact express permission to take out Thetis, Thrag doesn't do it, because no matter what, he believes in the sanctity of a pure Viltrumite universe. Unfortunately for him though, that's when Thetis decides to take care of Argal, becoming the betrayer and in his mind, cutting off the head of the snake. Little did he know, that wouldn't just not end the Empire, but it would cascade into the darkest moment in Viltrum's history. The Scourge virus is a very close second, both being horrific forms of genocide that become hard to watch at a point, yet the Purge was purposeful genocide on themselves. I mean, I guess the Scourge virus was too, but you know what I mean. Where the Purge stamped out any hope of kindness from within them in favor of brutality. Even the kids join in, and it's all set to Philip Glass's Violin Concerto No. 1, becoming dreadful to watch, but in a well-made way, as I'm contemplating the bleakness of it, but also left thinking about the flaws in Thrag's logic. Not the philosophical stuff, this is clearly beyond that. I'm talking about the small dumb nitpicks that come in the form of shower thoughts. Because like, maybe I'm a badass Viltrumite, but what if it's an off day? What if I have a tummy ache? I guess I'm dead. One of the hundreds that Conquest ripped apart just because he finally could. No, I wasn't saved in time by Thrag, the one person Conquest fears. I'm in that pile back there. Anyway, after Thrag instills his egotistical philosophy onto Viltrum once more, we cut to the present, with Thetis giving a rousing speech to his team of powerful allies, optimistic that they will finally succeed at cutting the head off of the snake, leading to what might be Invincible's most epic title card card yet. The last episode of Season 1 had a damn good one, but this might just top it. And because it takes time to fly over to Viltrum, that creates the perfect opportunity to slow down and force the characters to take stock of what they have and consider what they're doing, filling the next 5 minutes with some fun dynamics to play with. However, I do wish that they at least acknowledged that the last time Battle Beast and Invincible met was back in Season 1, where they didn't get along. I could have even taken a small glance, but no reaction at all was egregious. And while I'm bringing up more irrelevant nitpicks, I'm also surprised the sound attack, Viltrumite's kryptonite, didn't also come up. They wouldn't be able to use it anyway, considering half of their team would be affected, but it should have been discussed. Though Mark's not the brightest, so maybe he genuinely didn't think of it. But they eventually reach Viltrum, parking around the block so the surprise party isn't ruined. Yet for whatever reason, maybe the mole ratted Thetis out one last time and told Thrag, but they know. And the extended action scene that follows is just legendary. As always, following the comic pretty faithfully, but moving around key moments for peak pacing and drama. Zoe's finally holding her own, though she could have attempted a couple more shots at Thrag with the dart, and there's also a weird moment where Space Racer just about dies but gets real lucky, yet I'm willing to forego anything just to feel the giddy excitement I felt seeing Thrag kick into gear for the first time. For context, in the comic, Thrag is the ultimate villain, the final boss to beat, but he was never this scary, and that's down to how his raw power is depicted. He was hyped up throughout this episode and this season, being talked about as a figure to fear, but hearing about it and seeing it are two different things. Unlike the comic, Thrag only gets hit when he allows it, and when someone is unlucky enough to be hit by him, they're met with annihilation. Yet Thrag is reasonable to his own kind, attempting to convince Nolan to come home to his birthright, talking to him about the glory of their world, a place that intentionally looks muted and dull. But Nolan, not wanting to be a part of the black and white extremes of the Viltrum Empire any longer, and understanding the necessary gray, calls Viltrum a tomb. The first thing that angers Thrag into an emotional reaction, something that clearly doesn't happen often with this interpretation of Thrag, which I love. Where even after all that, Thrag takes the time to calm down and tell Nolan how sad this makes him, before sending him into the stratosphere with hurricane-level winds. And despite seeing his father get launched past him, and being told not to do this specific thing, Oliver decides to attack Thrag head-on, something he immediately regrets, ending up floating around the atmosphere without a jaw for the rest of the episode, most of which he's unseen, causing me to worry non-stop for his safety. But seeing his brother messed up like that does force Mark into a dark place, taking a breath, because I guess they're close enough to Viltrum's atmosphere, and exclaiming that he killed Conquest and that he'll kill Thrag too, which backfires on him and only interests the Viltrumites more. But Mark summons all of his fury into one devastating blow, and in one of the most jaw-dropping impact frames ever created, Thrag blocks it with his face, Rocky style, ultimately proving how, in a physical confrontation against this guy, you're just never going to win. And that's something that this episode isn't even done proving, because we cut back to Nolan still pinwheeling out into space, eventually finding his bearings and looking back to see the death below, helpless Oliver just floating by, and he decides that there's only one way they're going to win, flying down and grabbing everyone strong enough to help with his plan. I feel like Alan could have been in there, but he and Zoe are knocked away, which I guess is fine since he's got to protect her during the ensuing planetary explosion, making me wish Oliver got that same care. And what comes next is another phenomenal moment ripped straight from the comic, but as expected, adapts it expertly, letting it breathe and take time for them to follow Space Racer's laser beam all the way through the planet, showing the destruction on the surface in more devastating detail every step of the way. And I could comment on how they unrealistically kept their pants on, but what else is there to say other than this is perfect? They even have the symbolism of the laser blasting through the Viltrumite symbol, marking the moment the Empire truly ended. Because as it happens, Nolan was right here. It was a drastic measure that became their only option, but by destroying Viltrum, the Viltrumite war is ended. they won. But there's still plenty of great action and drama to be had in the Viltrumite War, because in the ruins of Viltrum, Thetis yells out to all the remaining Viltrumites, telling them that surrender is their only option, something they might have considered had it not been for Thrag, who makes his entrance screaming and crying, ready to rip and tear, avenging Argal in one fell swoop. Though I think he regrets not savoring some of that sweet suffering, and decides to take his time when killing Nolan, but Mark gets in the way, and as always, his indomitable spirit wins the day, because he lasts just long enough for Thrag to decide that enough Viltrumite death has occurred, leaving him and Nolan to die, but not expressly killing them. But Mark wakes up in the Coalition of Planets' safe hands, to his dad healed and Oliver healing in a Bacta tank, where Alan has been named interim leader of the Coalition to take care of one job: finding the remaining 40-odd Viltrumites, who are homeless, hiding somewhere in the galaxy. And it's a small win that they're basically gone, but Mark knows where they are, ending the episode without an after-credit scene, mind you, with him saying that they're on Earth. And this show always does that, not putting anything at the end of the penultimate episode to generate as much anticipation as possible, which works, but having to wait a week to see the payoff of this was unbearable, although it wasn't as bad as I figured it would be, considering that before this episode aired, I assumed that line was going to be the cliffhanger moment they ended the season on, just because I remember there not being much directly after, but boy was I wrong, bringing us to the finale in episode 8. Don't Leave Me Hanging Here, where instead of keeping everything predictable, they cleverly mix it up, doing the Game of Thrones route of having the true climax of the season being the penultimate episode, and having the finale be where the characters recuperate from those life-altering events, and the narrative prepares for the next season, though it does keep to the tradition of having Mark going through it. So how is he going to go through it this time? Well, this episode begins with the invasion of Earth, where we see a half-dozen Viltrumites going down to a city and laying waste to it, then showing Thrag on his ship, overseeing that happening across the planet, and as he flies out to join in on the fun, Mark snaps back too, returning to the conversation he was in with his father, because as it turns out, none of that was real. It was Mark's subconscious picturing the worst and forcing it into the forefront of his mind, taking the original concept from the comic and adapting it with infinitely more storytelling prowess and maturity, with Mark's imagination of what's happening on Earth being used as shocking flashes of gore, but in the show, these moments are separated and drawn out to hammer home how unstable Mark has become. And during this, we also get a scene of Alan expressing his feelings of imposter syndrome, not knowing how to step into Thetis' shoes, plus there's some levity to ease the unending tension, with Zoe attempting to strategize, only to realize that she's not being listened to, but even that joke has an edge to it, because Mark and Nolan weren't paying attention only due to them being lost and spiraling in depressed thoughts. But they, at long last, reach Earth, making the wise call of hiding behind the moon and scouting ahead, slowly scanning the planet and not immediately alerting the Viltrumites if they are there, except they look back to see that Mark is gone, with him looking at all those carefully laid plans and saying, nah, and rushing in. And I'm not a patient person, so I get it, but he flies down to find that Earth is fine. The Viltrumites seemingly aren't there, and in the comic, Mark gets to bask in that happiness for only a moment before Thrag shows up right then and there, but this is so much better, because like Mark, the audience knows better than to think that the Viltrumites aren't on Earth, but for now, there's no sign of them. So fittingly, Mark goes to the wisest person he knows, Debbie, who's upset that Oliver is healing up halfway across the galaxy, but temporarily drops it when she sees Mark freezing up, as he's imagining Thrag killing her, something I knew could not be real, but I had the what if in the back of my mind. Yet the show's not about to drastically alter the comic story that much, so obviously Debbie's not dead. And after some consoling, Mark tells her that Nolan is outside, leading to another fun conversation between them, where Nolan super speeds around Debbie and forces her to see that he is changing, something that is way too pushy, and proves how, despite all of Nolan's character work, he's still not in the right headspace, yet again making it about himself. Something that is all the worse when you look at it from Debbie's perspective, spending the last few years wondering what in the 2 decades they spent together was an act and what was real, if any of it was real. And in general, Nolan came back to Earth thinking all was going to be good, having fought in war, risking his life, and destroying Viltrum, but he doesn't understand that humanity will never forgive him. And I'm jumping around, but Nolan even goes to the mountainside to think about his mistakes and relive the memes. And here, Cecil gets to remind him further. And as they talk, they both get a little angry, becoming confrontational, which really just demonstrates how big a balls Cecil has. Where Cecil puts it plainly, that however much work Nolan's done, and whatever he thinks he deserves, he doesn't, and it'll never be enough. And I'm just gonna let Nolan sit in that and move back to Mark, who's happily going home to Eve and finding out what she's been going through. Not entirely, at least not yet, but does find out how poorly she's been handling the past few months alone, which isn't unexpected, as this is exactly what happens in the comic, but I figured they weren't going to do it for whatever reason. But no, they commit to delivering on the visual that Eve has broken down in her time alone, mainly thanks to the one big reason, which she tries to talk to Mark about, but skirts around the subject and lies to him about not knowing why her powers are back. Yet she quickly sees that Mark needs some TLC as well. How mentally, as much as he wants to be getting there, like he said he was, he's just not okay. And once he imagines Thrag killing Eve, just sitting there and knowing he can't do anything in that event, he acknowledges that there's nothing that can be done against Thrag. But luckily, Eve finally opens up to Mark about the one big secret she's been keeping. Yet another insane plot point from the comics. I thought the show might be too cowardly to adapt, but they did, convincing me that they won't shy away from other odd storylines in the future. But that of course being Eve's abortion. And Jillian Jacobs kills it delivering those scared, anxious lines, not being sure how Mark's gonna take it. Though unlike his dad, Mark doesn't only think of himself and immediately moves to provide solace for her, the ultimate act of manliness. But the next stop on Mark's depression tour is to the GDA, where Cecil's pissed, giving Mark the same anger he met Nolan with, but as Mark has yet another hallucination, even Cecil sees how messed up this kid is, with the Viltrumites possibly being on Earth being a great distillation of the idea that Mark feels solely responsible for keeping Earth safe, yet doesn't know how that crushing weight of responsibility is killing him. Though Mark is mature enough to call out how he can't do it alone and needs professional psychological help. So Mark's gonna get therapy, and thank God. But around this, I've skipped over some crucial stuff, such as Alan taking authority of the Coalition, Cecil calling off plans to save Rex and Monster Girl, though he could have easily just put the experimental portal somewhere more contained and not just right in front of them, and Debbie and Paul revealing that they've broken up. The last of which kinda bugs me, knowing it was probably gonna happen, but not liking how it was done, because we don't have to see them break up, and it makes sense why they did, with Paul explaining that Debbie's life is steeped in superheroes and fantastical space drama, and that she should go out to see how Oliver's doing, ending up with her traveling with Nolan along the way, but Paul and Debbie's relationship wrapped up as more of an afterthought than I care to see. But back with Mark, he's convinced by Eve to go on what is a superhero's equivalent of a nice Sunday drive, flying around and finally starting to believe that Earth is safe from the Viltrumites, unsure of how he'll get past any future freakouts, but ready to accept outside help. And I mentioned how much Debbie's death fakeout almost got me, but I haven't talked about how the rest of Mark's visions don't have that same punch, at a point even starting to get annoying. Yet that was all for a purpose, to lull you into a false sense of security, knowing that whenever Thrag showed up with that distorted shaky cam, you assumed it wasn't real. So when he does show up, you as well as Mark are not sure if it's actually him. But after Mark throws some pointless punches, Thrag explains his future to him, how Thrag and the other Viltrumites have to crash on Mark's couch for a few decades, most likely permanently, acting like a stubborn tomcat you almost never see unless their food bowl is empty. And Thrag lost the war, now having nothing, but just by showing up on Earth, now controls it. And the only way that Mark can stay home with Eve is by agreeing to Thrag's demands and allowing the Viltrumites to call Earth their home, where they inevitably rebuild their numbers until until they choose to leave or forcefully take the planet, which is all such an amazing endpoint to cap the season on, simply because every installment of this show has ended with a proclamation by Mark. Season 1 was an exception, with Mark simply wanting to finish high school, but Season 2 ended with him saying, "I need to get better," and the next season dealt with him attempting that in a world that kept on beating him down. Season 3 ended with him saying, "I will kill anyone who tries to hurt those I love," and the next dealt with him finding out where in those words he was telling the truth and where he was lying, and to end this season with Mark having a choice thrust upon him by someone else, leaving Mark in the regret and misery that follows, as well as leaving us, the audience, in that unease for a year, is just masterful. Where Mark is working towards a healthier place mentally, but with him collecting reasons to have PTSD and trauma like he's gotta catch them all, and with there being so much worse down the line for him, I just know Invincible is gonna have one entertaining yet heavy season next year, something made more evident by the fact that the last thing we get is an after credit scene of Alan receiving the Scourge Virus 2.0 and being told to unleash it, which you're pretty confident Alan won't do, but like with Mark, the show leaves us in that unease, allowing our imaginations to run wild while we wait to see the narrative continued, which makes for a season of television that isn't just great, but riveting to watch. I'm still not convinced it's their best yet, even after this careful examination proved how masterfully written most of it is, but it's just hard to beat how concise Season 1 was. Yet that puts me in a place of pure excitement for next year, knowing that every time we get more Invincible, it's a step up from what we got directly before, and maybe even on par with the best of what this show has to offer. But in that, I am curious as to what exactly we're going to get in Season 5. And rather than a dedicated video delving into what each episode plot could be, something I could still very well make in the future if you sandwich enjoyers want it, but a rapid fire bullet list of some stuff I imagine they'll include sounds good enough to me, particularly when I look at how long this video is already, though that does mean the non-comic readers should probably step out, because I would hate to be the one to ruin this spectacular story for you. You guys gone? Or just don't care about spoilers? Alright, let's get into my predictions for Season 5. Where I want to see that street level gravity guy getting taken in by Mark, Dinosaurus getting out and doing something catastrophic, another fight with Powerplex, crossing my fingers Aaron Paul changes his mind and chooses to come back, helping Universa, that weird B-list chess guy villain becoming a much bigger bad through what I guarantee will be adapted with as much tragedy as possible, and Mark actually taking progressive action. And up in space, we'll see Debbie and Nolan have a weird dynamic that I kinda don't want to see, but will most likely slowly and begrudgingly on Debbie's end, get back together, which feels weird to say out loud, and again, I genuinely hope doesn't happen, but I feel like it's coming. Then there's gonna be a fight between Nolan and Alan, leading to the Scourge Virus maybe coming to Earth. And I imagine Season 5 will go much further than that, and in my video predicting what happens in Season 4, I played it awfully safe and only guessed about half of what this season covered, so I should shoot for the moon with this and guess everything, but I don't want to just bullet point too much here. Besides, there's a lot left up in the air in my mind, such as Bulletproof's time as Invincible most likely being cut entirely, and part of me not thinking Rex and Monster Girl will come back next season. They might, and I'll be eating my words when they do, but I have a feeling they'll be held off for a season or two. And aside from that, I'd like to see more specials similar to the phenomenal Adam Eve one they made way back when, like a Battle Beast one to capitalize on the popular comic running right now, but I'm mystified why we didn't get a Rexplode one based on the Invincible Presents comic just like Adam Eve's, or just a bunch of new ones, because there are so many characters in this universe that deserve some of the spotlight the base show can't give. Yet it's a fun format the show has only ever used once. But I did just talk about why the MCU is wasting their special presentation format a couple weeks ago, so I won't rag on why Invincible is too. And entirely unrelated, but what do you think of my outfit? I try to dress up for my videos if I can, and I have this Nightwing workout shirt, so I figured it'd be fun to wear, but halfway through one of the recording sessions it took to make this long ass video, I looked down and realized I look kinda dumb. Plus, it's not immediately identifiable that this is Nightwing. And past that, I'm not sure how many people know why I'm wearing a Nightwing thing in the first place. So give me the typical comments. What did you think of this season of Invincible, and what do you think will be next? But really, do you know why I'm wearing a Nightwing shirt to review Invincible? But as always, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure to leave a like, subscribe for weekly video essays and reviews, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.